Here we are. Ow! Ow! He's digging his claws in. Socks, sit nicely. Look in there. Say hello to everyone. Nope, he's not bothered. This is late, of course, because I've only just started my YouTube videos, but I thought I should do a little post about my favourite books of last year, so you get a better idea of the kinds of things I like and the kinds of things I read. I've got a teetering stack. I post on Facebook and all those things. It used to be my blog in the days when I kept a blog, my top 10 books of the year each year. And I've done that for years and years, and it's a really useful list to keep. Last year I had too many, so I didn't publish it in the end anyway. Also, I couldn't decide. Whoops. On a final list. So what I'm going to do is talk about all the books that would have been in the constellation of favourites last year. Socks, don't lick your bum on a YouTube video. Oh dear. Anyway, I'll go through. These aren't in order of anything, not the order I read them in, or favourites or anything. Rainbow Rowell, Scattered Showers, which are short stories, in this lovely volume with kind of crazy coloured ink, but most of the book is purple. It's a bit precious and a little bit twee, but I loved her. I love her books. Actually, I don't love all of her books. The book I really loved, and I've read 2 or 3 times, is Fangirl, which is the book about writing fan fiction and going to university, being in college for your first term and living in halls. She just gets it completely. It helps that her characters aren't a million miles from the kind of the geeky world that I was used to. I went to college and wrote Doctor Who fan fiction and made all my friends record Doctor Who audio stories in our first term. Anyway, Scattered Showers is a whole range of stories from the last 10 years or so, I think. Christmassy, Star Warsy, a bit queer now and then, mostly straight, I think. Her characters and her world is a whole lot less queer and gender fluid than the packaging sometimes leads you to believe. But I do love her books a lot. Right. I've got a lot of Americans in the list this year. I've talked last time about reading this Travis Baldry's Legends and Lattes about the lesbian ogre who stops fighting. I think she's an orc rather than an ogre. She stops going on quests and missions in her fantasy world and opens a cafe instead. Very, very lovely, silly, heartwarming book. Another heartwarming one, Dear Moth Man, by Robin Gow, which is a kind of trans parable or magical realist story about a young trans boy who's obsessed with the Mothman and how the Mothman's going to appear in the woods quite near where he lives, and he leaves a letter or a journal in the form of letters in a book in the woods for Mothman to read. And it's very peculiar and dark and sweet. It was recommended to me by the guys at Bookworm bookshop, the kind of queer bookshop in Durham Indoor Market that I went to a couple of times last year. Really sweet little stall. Everything is queer and quite a lot of it kind of trans related. And Miles, I think, recommended this particular book. I bought a whole pile of stuff that day. including Miles's own books, which I enjoy. Very odd for me to go to the indoor market in Durham and buy science fiction and fantasy that I found there, because that was the place that I always went to. When in the 70s I was a kid, there was a stall right at the back that was messy and dirty and everything was heaped up, but it was full of gold, pulpy gold. Books that were just about mouldering away in the corner in this massive heap. And my father would stand in the corner waiting. It was freezing cold because it was down the back of the market hall near the river where it was icy. And I would dig out these very strange vintage science fiction books. And it's lovely to be buying new, spanking new, gorgeous books. Robin Gow, I think, is a tremendous and strange talent. Most of this is in verse as well, which I haven't said, which lends it a particular kind of feeling. The Americans do a lot of verse novels. We hardly ever do them over here. I really like them. I really enjoy them. Right, that's them. The Company of Strangers. This is an older book by a Canadian writer called Mary Meigs. Now, she is writing the behind-the-scenes story, the non-fiction story of one of my favourite films in the world, which is called The Company of Strangers, or Strangers in Good Company, it's sometimes called. One's American, one's Canadian, the title. But it's a Canadian film, a semi-improvised movie about a bunch of 7 or 8 women on a bus in the middle of nowhere who get lost, and they pitch up at this old house, abandoned house. They're all real people playing themselves, and they improvise this kind of very slow, gradual, tender disaster movie. That's how I describe it. A gradual and tender disaster movie in which they think they're starving, but they go fishing, they forage, they talk to each other, they explain their lives. It's a stunning film, I think. I first watched it in the very early 90s. It must have been a year after it came out, about 91, 92. And it was on very late at night on Channel 4, the place that you always found these wonderful late night art house, often gay movies. It's where I first saw fantastic things by Derek Jarman and people like that. And In the Company of Strangers was something I videoed and kept on for years and years on a tape till it fell to pieces. And I almost knew it off by heart. It's got the most wonderful soundtrack as well. It's beautifully filmed. Mary Meigs is the cleverest one amongst them. She's the writer and the artist who paints everyone's portrait. And she's a kind of feisty lesbian who comes out to one of the other characters in the middle of a field while they're bird watching. And that scene always stuck with me. It's a beautiful coming out scene, not least for the way that the woman she tells laughs and takes it so nicely, and she's so kind. Anyway, it's a wonderful film. And the book, I was amazed. My friend Erica gave me the DVD because I hadn't seen it for years and years, and it was a wonderful surprise to be reunited with the movie. And doing a bit of research, I found out that there was, in fact, a book. And the book she creates is a kind of behind the scenes, but it's not. It's mostly taken from interviews that she did with all the women, and talks about the reception of the movie afterwards, the trip around the world that some of them made to attend different festivals. And it's a lovely story in its own right, and to be treasured, I think. Ghost Dog by Dick Cate. Now, this is a kid's book, published by Glance in the 80s, and written by a teacher based in Ferry Hill in County Durham, very close to where I grew up. This is something I found in a very, very shabby, dirty charity shop in Stockport on a very gloomy day before Christmas. A shop that's really horrible. And whenever you take to the counters, twice the price that it was labelled as. But I did come away with this on this particular day. I had a feeling about it, and it's written in my exact dialect from my childhood. A book about a possible ghostly, what's called ghost dog that's sighted around the mining village of Ferry Hill, and about the characters around there. It's a beautifully written book. Forgotten about, neglected, as many of these things are, in favour of, flashier, sillier books that survive. Part of my job, I always thought, as somebody who talked about books and wrote about books, was to rescue things that would otherwise go missing in the great kind of mulch down of out-of-print books. And that's one of them that I would rescue. Millie Johnson's I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day, which I talked about last time. I love this book. It's very Christmassy. It's got wonderful characters, 6 wonderful characters that you get to know really well. It has a slightly spooky tinge and lots of laughs. It's a great book and one to revisit, I think, at Christmas, as I tend to do. Mostly Christmas is rereading. I read this early last year. It's knocked around in this house for years and years. Susie Quatro's memoir. I must have had this more than 10 years, about 15, before I got to it. It was bought for £2 in Fop in town, which is one of my favourite shops. I don't know why I didn't read it before. It's a really good memoir especially of the years where she first comes to Britain in the early 70s, and she's busking, and then she suddenly gets taken up, and they try to make her into a star. Her relationship with her family and how they know she's the talent in the family but treat her quite badly is all fascinating. It's really, really interesting. Quite well written. Her poetry comes in now and then, which is kind of nice. She's like many, often it's musicians, sometimes actors. I'm thinking of Diane Keaton as an actor, write memoirs, and they don't always have the best self-knowledge, or maybe they do, but they don't always see the humour in what they're saying, shall we say. So there's a few stories she tells where you think where they're funny despite the person telling them. It's interesting. She's a good storyteller, but sometimes it's like that thing in a novel, isn't it, where you're hearing a first-person account, but you're looking over the shoulder at what the real story is because they've slanted it in a particular way. Yeah, it's really enjoyable, though. A really good account of decades in pop music. Richard E. Grant's book. Now, I'm going to give him a free pass because I loathe and despise celebrity books. I think all those celebrity authors should be stopped from writing novels and memoirs, apart from the really good ones. And I think I'd allow Susie Quatro and I'd allow Richard E. Grant to write theirs, to carry on with theirs. I love this book. It's a very, very moving book about the death of his wife and their last year together, really. I'd read his earlier journals and loved them years and years ago. This is about a kind of stellar world that he moves in, where he's, getting visits from Prince Charles with a bag of oranges and running after Barbara Streisand round Hollywood. It's a kind of glitzy world in which he gets the joke of himself. He knows that he's a bit of a dickhead, basically. And he knows that his wife is the stronger and cleverer in their partnership. And he's watching her fade away as all these celebs visit. And as he goes off and works around the world making these TV shows and films, and it happens that he's making some of the most wonderful things like Loki and Can You Ever Forgive Me? It's when he's made that film with Melissa McCarthy, which is, I think, a fantastic film. Anyway, a lovely book. I mentioned the Return to Buffy, Return to Springfield series by Kendare Blake, published by Hyperion. It's kind of the next generation of Buffy. This is the first one. I read it at the end of last year. in every generation, and I just loved it. And I explained why yesterday. Fantastic book. And actually, those kind of fighty bitey fantasy things, I'd had enough of those years ago, and she's taken me back to them. This is a gorgeous reprinting of Helen Han's letter from New York, her columns for Woman's Hour in the late 70s, where she just evokes living on the fringes of Central Park, the upper, whatever it is, East Side in New York. Conjures up a whole life inside her tower block, and her friends and the parties they have, the Thanksgivings, the trips out, in her kind of terse, witty, slightly grudging style. I love all of her books. My friend Nick got me this very, very fancy edition with new pictures, published by a press called Manderley Press, which specialise in books about places, which I thought was a lovely idea for a list of books. I shall look for the rest of them, I think. Okay, almost finished. This, first of all, because I'll not say so much about this. Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. I'd read her A.J. Fikry book a few years ago and loved that. Last year, everybody was reading this. It was everywhere. And this was reduced massively in W.H. Smith's. But it's not a dopey book of the kind that kind of Richard and Judy choose all the time. Books where you read them and then they disappear out your head. The thrillers and things that they tend to choose are like kind of disposable in a way, I think. I've always found that I can't remember them. This will stay with me. It's about a subject I have no interest in, computer games and how they work, the history of them. But the three characters that we follow here over 2 or 3 decades who are obsessed with computer games, who invent a bestseller, and we hear about their lives afterwards, their entangled, crazy lives afterwards, is just brilliant. I love this book. But everyone's read that, so I needn't talk about that so much. Whiffle Lever, Too Full, by Bob Fisher. We're in the northeast, not too far from where I grew up. This is Middlesbrough, and Bob Fisher is a science fiction fan and a radio DJ, and he sets off on a quest in a year, probably about 15 years ago. It's about the time that Doctor Who first came back to TV. And he goes to every science fiction and fantasy convention he can find in a year to see what the fandom is like, to see how people carry on. And he meets people who love Monty Python, Doctor Who, Star Wars, Terry Pratchett, all those things. So he spends most of his time in terrible hotels and motels up and down the country, and in bars. The funniest bit, I think, is where he's in a Middlesbrough hotel and sees the cast of Blake Seven staring at him, and he's staring through this mist of dry ice and realises there is no dry ice, they're just all heavy smokers. And he's meanwhile dancing like a loon, and they're all watching him sceptically. Very, very funny moments. He's somebody who writes a first-person memoir who absolutely gets the joke of himself, and it's wonderfully ironic and cynical and hilarious, full of nostalgic bits as well about growing up in the northeast, a childhood which is very, very similar to mine, swinging off trees and reading books from W.H. Smith's. Lastly, this is from that era, from 1983, a science fiction collection called Constellations, edited by Malcolm Edwards, a book that I've dipped into over the years but only read in one piece this time last year, and it's the most astonishing collection. It's like a brilliant introduction to late 20th century science fiction for kids. You know, you can barely believe that they'd be given these riches, these adult and complicated stories. Uncompromising, I'd say they are. And it's got one of my favourites that I always talk about, Philip K. Dick's Beyond Lies the Wub, and Gary Kilworth, again, somebody I've raved about when I talked about Other Edens. His story here is his first one, Let's Go to Golgotha, which is the most amazing science fiction time travel take on the crucifixion story. It's the story for Easter. Well, it's kind of up there with Behold the Man by Michael Moorcock, another completely sacrilegious take on that story. And a Kurt Vonnegut story, which I think is a very, very sarcastic and funny one called Harrison Bergeron, about how the mediocre will inherit the earth. Yeah, Vonnegut is scandalously funny and sarcastic. And, you know, we need that kind of satire and sarcasm in our world today, I think. So that's my heap of books from last year that I loved. I read about 120 books or something last year. It was a lot. And a lot of them weren't as good as that. And that's just the way of it, isn't it? Anyway, I've gone way over length again. I hope you're still watching. I hope you will press like underneath and leave comments and subscribe and all those things. Socks, have you got anything to say? Nope, he's fast asleep in my lap. As usual, and he'll probably stay there for this afternoon when I intend to read, actually. I've got to finish a William Boyd book that I'm not liking very much for my book club next week. And I have to package up some prints for a art fair at the weekend that I'm going to be selling things at. But I've done some painting. I've written a short chapter of my ongoing novel today, what I hope is my thriller. And I've now made a video. Anyway, see you soon. Take care.